When I talk to people, I always say that for Indigenous people, our ceremonies are every day, our medicines are everywhere, and that we just need to pick them up. And so your spark never completely goes out. Sometimes when we go through trauma, we forget about these simple things that make us smile. Getting out in the morning, watching the sun come up, or getting out at night, watching the sun go down. So those simple things help us to get through that. For our youth, I always say that when we have all this trauma, one of the things that we need to do is how do we brighten that spark? So you might get involved in volunteering in your community, doing some good things in your community, helping out somebody in your community also.
You're listening to Ask Angela, the podcast that answers your questions about how to improve your mental health, connects you to diverse voices of wisdom and expertise, and helps you get the tools and strategies you need to live a more connected life. Today, we're diving into a topic that's foundational to everything we will discuss in this podcast series. I can't think of a more fitting place to start, because I think that before we can truly connect with others, we need to connect with ourselves. Today, I have George Couchie in the studio. George will join shortly to talk about how we find our spark, the importance of belonging, and the impact of history on culture. Hello, George. How are you today?
Good.
Good. It's really nice to have you here today. And I'm just wondering if you might be able to introduce yourself as we start talking today about safety and connection.
So my name is George Couchie. I come from Nipissing First Nation. I was a police officer for 33 years. I was with North Bay City Police, Nipissing First Nation Police, the Nishnabek Police Service, and then I finally finished off with the OBP. And while with the OBP, I was fortunate. They were sending me all over Ontario when I was a police officer, and it was mainly with regards to Indigenous issues like Ipperwash. There was residential schools, so I got a lot of knowledge out of that. And when I retired, that's really what I was starting to do. And people always ask me, when are you ever going to retire from doing that? For me, it's more of a passion, especially where I come from, my community. So if I was in my community, it's a Boju, Dishnakaj, Gibawanasa, Nipissing Dojaba. And that is the only Ojibwe that I know. But in our language, Zangadi is Strongheart. That's my spirit name. And my clan name is Zungat, or Gibawanasa clan, which is the Red-Tailed Hawk clan.
Tell me a little bit about how all of that experience sort of plays out in your everyday world right now.
So I guess one of the things that brought me into where I'm doing now was to understand the impact of what history had on Indigenous people, and how we are still trying to find out who we really are. So when I was 30 years old, they had asked me to, after Ipperwash, and really that really changed my view how the police were dealing with Indigenous people. There was lots of racism in the police. And before I had gone to Ipperwash, I was thinking, oh, why are they there? They shouldn't have been in the park. Then when I got there and I listened to the testimony of the people, and then I realized they had every right to be in the park, and the OBP shot an unarmed man. And so there was a history of our communities that were struggling. Especially when I work at summer camp with all the kids, I always ask them, how many here want to grow up to be an alcoholic? Nobody puts their hands up. Then I'll ask, how many here want to grow up to be drug addicted? Nobody puts their hands up. How many here want to take their own life? Nobody puts their hands up. Then I'll say, okay, now what I want to ask you a question is, how many here know somebody that's an alcoholic in your family? And 100% of the kids put up their hands. Then I'll ask, how many here know somebody that's got a drug problem in your family or your community? 100% put up their hands. Then I'll ask, how many here know somebody in your family or your community that has taken their own life? And 100% put up their hand. So again, it's when I talk to the kids, I say, everyone that comes into the circle, when we do circles with our youth or community, that everyone has a broken piece. You're not broken, you just have a broken piece. And we need to find out what is that broken piece that you're carrying, so you're not recycling it to the next or you're not giving it to the next generation. We hope to recycle that, so we change that ripple effect in our communities. So when we work with youth, yesterday we did a drum workshop at Mother St. Bride's, and there was some 40 students, and probably out of the 40, there was probably 15 Indigenous students that were there. So for them, it was learning about their own culture and their own history. When I was a young man, my father was a residential school survivor, so he really knew nothing about his own culture, and so that wasn't passed down to me. So I had to engage as a police officer with my own community, really to understand where we are now and how do we change that next generation that comes along.
What is the knowledge that you would impart to help people connect to that spirit or spark?
I guess one of the things that I always do when I'm very open with people about my own history. And I guess, like when I was a kid, my father was a residential school survivor, so we were first generation not to go to residential schools. So I remember as a little kid getting picked up by a big yellow bus, and it was a white bus driver. And so they drove us into Corpus Christi School in North Bay. So I get to the school's all white, teachers are white, all the students are white, and we learn about history, we learn about culture, learn about history, the music, and everything was white. So as a young man, I always wanted to see myself as normal, and normal was being the dominant society. So as a young kid, that was the last thing I wanted to be, was Indigenous, because it was a constant reminder as a kid that we were drunk, lazy, uneducated. When you watch TV, old Western movies, who was always the bad guy? It was Indigenous people. And it was a constant reminder as you were growing up. So what I try to teach kids now is that sense of belonging. Where do you belong? Why should you be proud of who you are? And giving them a sense of ownership to their language, their culture. The other day I was walking through a store, and this older man stopped me, and it was a retired police officer. He said, "Oh, I went to a church group." He said, "I'm not very religious, but I went to a church group. They had a big meal, and they were talking about residential schools. Did it really happen?" And so for Indigenous kids, when I talk to them, I said, you really got to find out who you are, especially your communities. And you also have to understand the trauma that you're carrying, so that you're not passing it on to the next generation. And that a friend of mine said to me one day, he said that men cannot be scared without being angry. And so I kind of thought about that. And when I was in high school, there was a guy in my class, a great big guy, and where everybody was 140, he was 220 pounds and 6'4". And I remember somebody teasing him about his hair. You know, where'd you get your hair cut? And did your mom cut it? And he just lost it and picked up this guy, 6'5", over top of his head and threw him against the bus. And next day I was his best friend. When I became a police officer, with North Bay City Police, and it was, for me, what I would do at night on evening shift was going to the library and read old police reports. And so this Indigenous guy that I knew, I really kind of lost contact with him. But then I was reading some of the reports, and his mother had taken her own life when he was in grade 11. Year after that, his dad took his own life, and then a couple of years after he finished high school, he took his own life. And so there was a lot of anger in that man, and especially with Indigenous kids, I find a lot of anger with them that's been passed down from one generation to the next generation. Even when I do work with police officers, Indigenous officers, I always remind them, like, not only did your parents have trauma, but you had trauma growing up in that household from your parents. And then going into school, the trauma of racism. And now as a police officer, you have trauma here also. So you're compiling your trauma on trauma on trauma. And so you have to understand, how do we change that trauma in our communities? Again, it's about how do we go back to who we really are. And for Indigenous people, who we are now is not who we are. So again, how do we find out about our own history and our own, and again, it's the sense of belonging. How do you belong to something?
I was curious too about that anger that you said, you might have to repeat it, but about the grown man, that the scared is anger. Is that what you?
Yeah. So men can't be angry without being scared.
Okay.
Or it can't be scared without being angry. So I guess when I think back to when I played high school hockey or I played football, and for me, when I got on the ice was a legal place to be angry. You can be angry on the ice, do crazy things. And I'd be thrown out of high school hockey every year for doing something crazy. Because I got on the ice and I think, okay, before he hits me, I'm going to hit him. So I would go out of my way to knock people down. And people used to say to me, man, God, do you ever get scared? And really, that's why I was doing that. And,
right.
And even when I've talked to people in our own community, the older men now, and I talk about their anger when they were growing up. And they said to me, sometimes I was being angry. I didn't even know I was being angry. And I also hear people say that, well, women are so emotional. They're always so emotional. And I say, okay, is anger an emotion? And they go, well, yeah, it is. And I say, are men emotional? And then they have to say, yeah, there's a lot of anger with our kids. And so it's having that understanding, again, where that anger is coming from. Whether it's your parents, and I always used to think about, oh, maybe my parents weren't great parents, but then I think back now, they didn't have the tools to deal with their own trauma, let alone my trauma that I was going through. So it was just one thing after another. So again, what we're hoping when I teach youth now is about learning about their culture, their language, who they are, and not just Indigenous kids, but all kids that come into the circle when I talk at the schools. It's just not all Indigenous kids, it's every kid that comes in. We talk about those simple things like, the seven grandfathers or the spark that I talk about. And again, it's about how do we discover who we are.
And so when we're talking a bit about the teachings and the spark, you said, when you're in that circle, can you bring us there into that circle and maybe just talk about a little bit about the teachings that you might share, one or two or all of the grandfather teachings, or, sort of an essence of what is it that you would share in those moments with Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids that might help them sort of find that spark and to discern that truth.
So one of the things that I talk about when we come into that circle, so there's an opening in that circle at the eastern door where the sun comes up in the morning. So we don't put a chair there. And I said, okay, we come into the circle, we come in through that eastern door. That's where life starts. The sun comes up in the morning. We're never promised a tomorrow. And so we all find a chair. And as we sit down, and I talk about the summer camp with the kids, that everybody's carrying something. And I remind everybody in my circle there that everybody comes with a broken piece. Later on in that circle, I'll ask people, how many here have ever had trauma? And everybody puts their hands up. And I'll say, all of you, while you were driving here this morning, something was going through your mind that you're thinking about, something that's bothering you. And that everybody has a story. When you see people on the streets struggling, like in the city of North Bay, I was at Twig's restaurant this morning, and there was 3 or 4 street people out in front. And I got to thinking, how did they get to this point in their lives? What is the story that they carry? A few years ago, when I was downtown Main Street here in North Bay, there was a young guy with his pants down to his knees, and it was really a cold March night, and he looked like he was picking apples out of the sky. And as I was watching him, I turned to my side and I saw my wife, and she was watching me, and she said to me, probably when he was 3 or 4, somebody loved him. And she says, you wonder how he ever got to this point in his life. So it kind of makes people realize that the people that we go to school with or we work with, everybody has a story. Something's going on in their mind. And even if you're married or you have a brother and sister, you never know what's going on in their minds also. There's something everyone has a struggle. And so when we go into that circle, I say one of the things that we talk about in our culture is that spark that we've been given. So in our traditional stories, they say many years ago, the Creator, before there was anything that was evolved, the Creator took a small stone, put it in his hands, rubbed it really hard, and a small spark came out of that. And he gently blew on that spark, and it got brighter and brighter and hotter. And he took that spark and he put it into the sky. We call it Grandfather Sun. And Grandfather Sun comes up each morning, puts electrons onto the earth, and keeps us warm during the day. He then took a piece of spark out of that and he put it into the earth. And that spark looks after Mother Earth each day, keeps her warm. And from that spark, he took another piece off of that spark, and he put it in everyone's hearts. Everyone has a piece of spark inside of them. And it's how we look after that spark. It looks after us as we get older. So a couple of things when I talk to kids, I say that you can't talk down to your spark, or you can't abuse your spark. And your best friend has a spark, so you can't talk down to his spark or abuse her spark. That your spark can, when people are going through tough times, their coldest moments in life, your little spark can help them in their darkest or coldest moments, but can also help them in their darkest moments. So I always say to kids, you be the spark that lights up a room when you walk in. So somebody walks in the door and, hey, there he is. And I said, don't be the spark that lights up the room when you walk out. Oh, he's finally gone, And your spark can create a huge fire in a community. And you can't have a fire without that spark. So you got to look after that spark. And your job for the rest of your life is to look after your brother's spark or your friend's spark. And each day you need to check on their spark. How's your spark today? Especially for Indigenous youth, I always say that in our community we have high rates of suicide, high rates of addictions. And I say that's not an option anymore because your spark can be put out through alcohol and drugs. So you got to stay away from those things. When I was doing a talk one time, a young man came up to me. He said, when you said that, he said, when I got into drugs, he said the first couple of times we'd laugh, we'd do our drugs, watch TV. And he said, then I realized that I was addicted because we would watch TV and I don't even remember what we saw. And he said, I don't even remember. We didn't laugh anymore. We just sat there. And he said, then I knew I was addicted. And he said, then I knew that spark wasn't inside of me. So everyone has a spark that we need to look after that. Every little kid has a spark. One of the times I was at a high school or a grade school, and this Indigenous kid, I was standing with the principal, and a little Indigenous kid ran in between me and the principal. And the teachers, I said, who is that little guy? And he was just trying to get to school, get to class before 9:00. And she said, oh, you probably know his dad. He's a badass in your community. And I said, actually, I know his grandfather. He's a badass. And we'd almost pigeon this kid to be the next badass in the community. but he's not. He's in university. He's doing quite well. So I always remind teachers or police officers, I say, when you see those kids coming through your front door, not only are you looking at one generation, but you could be looking at 3 generations. And how do we stop that ripple effect in the community with the trauma that they're carrying? And I always remind our kids, I said, you need to set the example in your community or your family. And so you need to learn about, who you are, where you come from, and your language.
Yeah, and there's also a responsibility to us as people to become more culturally aware, culturally competent, in recognizing that each individual, does have that spark and is allowed to show up in the world just who they are. And you spoke about that one young person with the drugs, and you said that he felt that he was addicted and that his spark had sort of gone out, but your spark can never really go out, can it? Or can it, would you say?
When I talk to people, I always say that for Indigenous people, our ceremonies are every day, our medicines are everywhere, and that we just need to pick them up. And so your spark never completely goes out. And I always say, no one's ever broken. You just have a broken piece.
Right.
And you just have to find where that spark is. Even when I talk to police officers about trauma within their own, being a police officer, I said that sometimes we forget about what is our spirituality. What spirituality, a friend of mine who was a priest said one time, we were talking about spirituality and religion, and he said, religion is a set of facts or circumstances that's followed by the group or the norm that sometimes control our behavior. Mm-hmm. And he said, spirituality is what makes you happy. And so I ask people all the time, I said, what makes you happy? Some people go, oh, my dog does, or my kids, or when I listen to music, or when I go for a walk in the bush. And then I'll remind them, I said, okay, how many here love to listen to the rain? Oh, yeah, I love listening. Or the thunder. Oh, yeah, I love doing that. Or listening to the wind in the winter. And I said, so sometimes when we go through trauma, we forget about these simple things that make us smile. Getting out in the morning, watching the sun come up, or getting out at night, watching the sun go down. So those simple things help us to get through that. And again, for our youth, I always say that when we have all this trauma, one of the things that we need to do is how do we brighten that spark? So you might get involved in volunteering in your community, doing some good things in your community, helping out somebody in your community also.
George, what is it that's sparking you up these days? Like, what is it that's lighting you up, would you say?
So I guess we just had another addition to our family. It's a little boy, Nicaraya, and his name is Nick. We've given a spirit name, which is Bekanagan, means the one who's victorious. And so for our family, it's that connection. And, we spend a lot of time FaceTiming because they live in New Liskeard, but that's probably one of the things that sparked me. And when I go to do lectures now, that gives me an extra spark also.
What are the things that you're talking about the most, would you say, right now?
It's half and half. I still do a lot of work in Indigenous communities. We're trying to find out our own culture, our own history. And so, again, it's going into communities, talking about that. I do some work with Indigenous policing also on trauma, and with a lot of the officers that I work with, they have a lot of trauma. And even if they don't think they have trauma, there's trauma in there also. And I also do some work with non-Indigenous police services. I've been doing a lot of work with York Regional, Peel Regional, the RCMP. And so I go down and talk to, it's a one-day talk. In the morning I talk about culture, the spark, the 7 grandfather teachings. And then in the afternoon I talk about the effects of history on Indigenous people, like through the Indian Act or residential schools or Indian hospitals. And so there seems to be more of an interest on those topics, especially with police services that are that they need to have some training on that.
There's an interest from the officers themselves or the organizations, would you say?
When I first started to do it was the organizations now. Before was the organizations. Now we have officers that are interested in working with us or coming to listen. When I did the workshop yesterday with the schools, I had asked the North Bay City Police and the Ontario Provincial Police, there was a few officers. I said, why don't you come down, help me out? And so we had 4 officers doing that yesterday. And they were just so thankful after we did that they were able to take part. And the kids were excited to see the police there also. So most of my work now is probably half and half in Indigenous communities and outside of there.
Sort of building those bridges and the knowledge and cultural kind of competency, right? With would you say or
people when I started first doing the training, they used to call it cultural safety.
Okay.
But when I hear that word safety, when I was a police officer, they would give us training on firearms, explosives, and it was safety training. So you didn't blow your fingers off or you didn't shoot yourself. So when I hear cultural safety, it's like there's something bad's going to happen.
Right.
So, and when I hear cultural competency, that means after you're done, you're competent. Even the numbers of years that I've been teaching about culture, I don't see myself as competent. So now I call it cultural mindfulness. Is how do we become mindful, not just of how we see people, but how do we become confident or cultural mindfulness when we go home at night? I always say that racism starts at our kitchen table when we're sitting around with our kids eating supper. And so how do we change that mindset of people when they go home at night? So, and that's why I call it cultural mindfulness, being mindful how you speak to people and how you deal with people. And again, it's just not with just Indigenous people, but anyone that we're dealing with, especially with our own family.
When you talk about cultural mindfulness, how is it that you shifted it to that wording for yourself? And I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the use of cultural mindfulness over cultural competency and that. So can you tell me just a bit more about that?
I guess when I started to do the lectures, I've got a good friend, Dr. Paul Preston in North Bay here, and he was actually my doctor for a while. And then, but we were talking about that one. He had come to listen to me speak, and he said, like you're talking about cultural safety, and we'd gone through those things that I told you about.
Right.
And he said, really, what you're talking about is something about being mindful how you're dealing with people. And then we thought, this is a good, so that's why we used it, being cultural mindfulness, being mindful of everything that you do, and really just not me teaching about culture, but being mindful how you're dealing with people. And your kids, my granddaughters are probably my best teachers. One day we went into the mall and this lady came over and she wanted to help us, and we're in a store, and the lady never stopped talking the whole time. Like she would just continually talk to the salesperson. And then after we left the store, I said to my granddaughter, I said, that lady never shut up. And she said, but what would happen if she never did speak? And I thought, yeah, you're right. And then another time we're coming in, and this was my youngest granddaughter, and there was an older man walking behind us, and I thought, okay, this is my turn to practice the 7 grandfather teachings. So I went up to the door and I held the door, and the older man came beside me, and he said, "Oh, thank you, sir." And my granddaughter ran to the next door, and she grabbed the next door and she held it open. And the man said to her, "Oh, this is beautiful. Thank you." And so when I got up to her, I said, "That was awesome." And she said, "I just watched what you were doing." And so then it made me realize when we don't think people are watching, that's when we're watching. And be mindful how you speak at home, because there's always somebody listening. And so when I talk about the 7 grandfather teachings, we talk about bravery and courage, that everybody needs that. When I talk to our youth, I say that you're going to do something extraordinary in your life, better than everyone else's. And you have to find that bravery and courage to get up to speak, for somebody that can't get up to speak, and also sit down and listen. You need to be brave enough to say, oh, yeah, okay, I need to sit down and listen. And that as a young man, after my father died, I was in probably grade 9, and I had a lot of anxiety as a little kid. And after he died, it seemed some of it dissipated. And so I got into boxing, and I remember my boxing coach would yell us. His famous line was, "It's not how hard you punch; it's how hard you can take a punch." So he'd be yelling, "Get up, move."
Right.
And then when I got into policing, when I was on the emergency response team, the sergeant, after we did the training, we did 6 weeks training, and he said, okay, before we send you out, you're going to be the first team to go out. If there's a shooting, if there's a hostility, you're going to set up the outer circle so people can't come in or get out. And he said, your chance of being shot are much higher now. And he said, I got shot twice. He said, the first time they shot me, knocked me down, and as I laid on the cement, I thought, this is where I was going to die. And then they shot me again. All I could think about was my wife, my children, even my grandkids I didn't even have. And he said, that's what motivated me to get up. And he said, I started to run. So if you get shot out there, don't lay down and die. You got to get up and run. And especially in our kids in our community, I always say that when things knock you down, you got to get up anyways. You got to keep on moving. Use that bravery and courage that you've been given. And so one of the other ones that we talk about is humility, being humble in life. And being humble in life sometimes in just winning battles when nobody knows that there's a battle being fought, or doing good things when no one's watching. When I talk to police officers, I always say, try to catch the kids, not while they're doing bad things, but catch them while they're doing good things.
Right.
And being humble is not always being right, but not always pushing that. So if you're right, but somebody else is arguing it, maybe you're right too. Being humble sometimes is listening. A friend of mine is a psychologist, and we were talking one time about, I said, how does it work to being a psychologist? And he said, number one rule, shut up and don't say anything. Just listen and nod your head.
Yeah.
And as a young man, when I was with North Bay City Police, I got a job with the North Bay Centennials being the strength coach when Bert Templeton was there. And I was walking into the arena, or running into the arena one time. I'd forgotten something. I told my wife, I'll be 5 minutes. So I went back into the arena, and I was running through the arena, and there was a guy working there, and he saw me, and he goes, hey, George. So I walked over to him, and I said, what do you need? He said, do you have a minute? I thought, okay, my wife has 4 minutes, you have 1. And I said, what can I do for you? He said, can you be charged for suicide? And I said, well, as crazy as that sounds, in the 1960s you could be, but not anymore. And then I said to him, why? Are you thinking of suicide? And he said, well, me and my wife don't get along anymore, and my health has deteriorated, and I hate coming to work. I said, do you have a plan? He said, I was going to go home and shoot myself tonight. So we started to talk, and we probably talked about an hour, and then we came up with a plan to get him up to the hospital, let his boss know what's happening. And we got him some help. But even when I go to the hockey game now, I still walk by that place and I think, imagine if I had run by him, if he had said, hey. And so when I talk to our communities, I said, everybody has a struggle that you don't know. And, being humble and listening, which is so important. And the other grandfather we talk about is wisdom. Wisdom comes through us a lot of times through trauma. And I always tell people that when you go through trauma, don't forget to get your gift. There's a gift that comes with that. And when I look back when my father died, I think back now, his death changed my life. It made me who I am, shaped me to the person I am. And I think back now that I was given a gift through that trauma. And even his journey in the residential schools, I was given a gift out of that now. So I don't carry his anger anymore, but I carry the gifts that were given to me. So that wisdom, even with our youth, I met kids that are wise beyond their years. And kids seem to become wise when they go through trauma. They lose their innocence. So, at the summer camp when we were running with the OBP, there was kids that would come to the camp. There was a young guy there. He was looked like he was 21, and we would only take kids from 13 to 17. And so when the kids come into the camp, I ask them, "Why are you here?" And so we're in the circle. He gets up and he goes, "Oh, my name is John. I'm 16. He said, "Me and my sister," and he pointed to a little girl beside him when she was 13. He said, "This is my little sister. She's 13. Last year, my mother died of an overdose. And we don't know who our dad is. We've never met him. And after my mom died, my grandfather came and got us and took us home. The Children's Aid found out and took us away from my grandfather, saying that he wouldn't be able to look after us properly. And shortly after that, my grandfather took his own life. And after we did the circle, there was some of the officers that were sitting with me, and they said, "Oh my God, that kid is wise beyond its years." And so when we meet some of those people that are wise beyond their years, it's that trauma that they carry, and how do you use that? And we also talk about truth in our communities, how we speak. Be careful how you speak, because there's always somebody listening, whether at home or work. And honesty is how we walk. So walk like the person you want to follow. Be careful how you walk, because there's always somebody walking behind you, watching you. I always think about the time where my son and I, he was about 15, and we were going through the bush, and he had a can of pop and threw it into the bush. And I stopped and I said, "Oh, who's going to pick that up now?" So we argued, and finally he took it home. When he hit 25, he came home and he said, "Dad, I got the funniest joke to tell you, or the funniest story." I said, "Okay." He said, "Me and Curtis were walking through the bush the other day, and he was drinking a can of pop, and then he threw it into the bush. We stepped one step, and I said, 'Now, Curtis,' and he said, my son said to me, 'Dad, I could hear your voice.'" And so when you don't think your kids are listening, then they're listening. The last grandfather teachings we talk about, or the last two, is love and respect. When I was a young policeman with North Bay City Police, we'd go to domestics. And this was back in the 80s. And back in the 80s, if the lady, most of the time the complainants were women, the victims were women. And if the women didn't want us to lay a charge on domestic, then we couldn't lay the charge. And as soon as we got to this house, men would change their attitude big time. They'd see the police, "Oh, I love you. This will never happen again," say to his wife. And so we'd say to the wife, "Do you want him charged?" And she'd say, No, he's all better now." And in 2 weeks, we come back to the same house. Now I tell our men, I tell people, when the sun rises each morning, and whatever it shines on, we need to respect. So on people, animal life, or the earth, we need to respect. And so you need to respect those women in our community. The last one of the 7 grandfather teachings is love. So love doesn't cost anything, doesn't weigh anything, but it sure can change a person's life. So one of the things I ask people in the circle, I'll say, "How many here have brothers and sisters?" Everybody puts their hands up. I said, "How many here have ever told your brother and sister they were idiots or morons or fools?" Everybody laughs, put their hands up. Then I'll say, "How many here in the last 2 weeks have told your brothers and sisters how much you love them?" The last group I did, out of 20 people, one person put up their hand. And I said, "Don't be going through somebody's funeral or standing over someone's coffin and tell them how much you love them. You need to do that while they're still alive." And so, especially with young kids, I always remind them, when we hand out the wristbands with the 7 grandfather teachings, I said, you need to share those, especially when you get home at night. And so what I want you to do is go home tonight and tell someone that you love them. Share that 7 grandfather teaching with them. When I was a young police officer, I investigated the young man had taken his own life, and my job was to go and tell his parents. So when I got to the house, the mom was by herself, and she was just devastated. And she said, "Can you wait? My husband isn't home. Would you stay with me?" I said, "Sure." So when the husband got home, the first thing out of his mouth after I told him, he said, I never told my son how much I loved him, but I know he must have known just the way I treated him. And I tell people, never assume your kids know, or never assume your parents know. You got to tell them all the time. Doesn't cost anything, doesn't weigh anything. And so those 7 grandfather teachings, I say, when you're going to build the house, you want to build a strong foundation to your house. The 7 grandfather teachings are that foundation that you need to build. So when you're a young kid, when you get a girlfriend or boyfriend, you give them all the 7 grandfather teachings. When you go to a university, you pass them to your buddies. When you get a job, whether you're a policeman, a doctor, or a businessman, you got to use those 7 grandfather teachings. When you get a family, you give all the 7 grandfather teachings. In our culture, they say that we carry 2 wolves inside of us. One wolf with anger, violence, racism. The other wolf is the 7 grandfather teachings. And I always tell people, if you carry that anger, that will make you sick. Especially with Indigenous people, I say we're always first in line when nobody wants to be first, and we're last in line when nobody wants to be last. And so we need to change how we're looking at ourselves. And so we need to carry those 7 grandfather teachings. And so it's which wolf we feed in life that will succeed. So if you want to stay healthy, you got to carry the good 7 grandfather teachings.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to learn more or find out about services or groups that I offer, you can go to my website, therootedheart.ca. You can find this podcast on my YouTube channel at The Rooted Heart, and they're also available on Apple and Spotify.